Chapter 8. Catherine awoke to the sound of her parents' carriage returning home. The clump of the horse's hooves on the drive loud and distinct against the muffled backdrop of ocean waves. She didn't know how many hours had passed, but it was still dark outside, and she dug herself deeper beneath her covers, yanking the quilt up past her nose. Her head was drowsy with fog and sleep. She had the sensation of sleepy tendrils clinging to her from some far-off dream, arms lowering her onto a bed of rose petals, fingers tracing the contours of her face, kisses trailing down her throat. She sighed, curling her toes against the sheets. He appeared slowly from the mental haze, messy black hair, amber gold eyes, a dimpled smile stretched across teasing lips. Her eyes snapped open, a blush climbing up her neck. She'd been dreaming about the Joker. Again. Downstairs, she heard the front door crash open, her mother's voice splitting through the still night. She sounded upset, and Kath cringed. Was she angry that Kath had left the ball without telling them? Or that the king's marriage proposal had been slighted? Maybe he'd asked some other girl. Energized with hope, she pulled the quilt away and peered up at the shadowed canopy of her bed. She gasped. Not a lemon tree this time, but roses. They were white as swan feathers, their thorny stems strangling the bedposts. Kath inched one hand from beneath the covers and reached for the nearest blossoms. A thorn dug into the pad of her thumb, and she flinched, pulling back and popping the wound into her mouth before she got blood on her nightgown. Giving up on the rose, she whipped the blanket over her head again, letting her heart beat slow. What did it mean? What were the dreams trying to tell her? She counted off the things she knew about Jess. He was the court joker, but no one knew where he had come from. He was friends with a raven. Impossible was his specialty. The way he had touched her hand had awoken something inside her she had never felt before. Something giddy, but also nervous. Something curious, but also afraid. And if her dreams are to be believed, he was a very, very good kisser. The fluttering in her stomach returned, and she squirmed further into the covers, suddenly lightheaded. Perhaps his presence in the castle gardens had been unexpected and disconcerting, but Kath was the master of her own whimsies. She began to wrap herself up in the dream of slow kisses and white roses, to find her way back to that small, harmless fantasy. Her bedroom door crashed open. "Catherine!" Startled, Catherine pushed back the bedcovers and sat up. A ring of lamplight shone on the walls. "What?" Her mother shrugged, but it was an overjoyed sound. "Oh, thanks to goodness! Willagig, she's here! She's all right!" With a wail, she threw herself across the room, pausing to set the oil lamp on the bedside table before she collapsed onto Catherine's bed and pulled her into a stifling embrace. Catherine realized with a start that her mother was crying. "We were so worried." "What for?" Kath struggled to extricate herself. "I left the ball early and came right home. I didn't think you'd be so upset. I wasn't feeling well and..." No, darling. It's fine, it's just..." She dissolved into sobs, and Kath's father appeared over them, pressing a hand to his heart. His face was slack with relief. "What's going on?" said Kath, spotting Marianne too in the doorway. "What's happened?" "We didn't know where you were," her mother cried. "And there was... "An attack," her father answered, his voice somber. Kath stared at him, trying to read his expression in the unsteady lamplight. "An attack?" "Not just any attack," Her mother pulled back and squeezed Kath's shoulders. A Jabberwock! Her eyes widened. It attacked the castle, said her father, looking strained and exhausted. Shattered 2 of the windows and took 2 of courtiers right from the ballroom floor. Then it just flew off with them. Kath pressed a hand to her chest. The Jabberwock was a creature of nightmares and myth, of tales told by firelight to frighten little children into good behavior. It was a monster said to live amid the twinging and tangled tulgey wood, far away in the country of Chess. As far as Kath knew, no Jabberwock had been sighted in Hearts for countless generations. Stories told of them being hunted by great knights centuries ago, until the last of Jabberwock was slain by a king who carried the mythical Warpole sword. It was enormous, her mother stammered, and terrifying, and I didn't know where you were. Her sobs overtook her again. It's all right, Mama. Kath squeezed her tight. I've been home all night. And still dreaming, I see, said her father. Her mother pulled back and got at the thorny rosebush. Not another one. What is going on in that head of yours? Kath gulped. I'm sorry, I don't know where they're coming from. Her mother slumped back and rubbed the tears still caught in her eyes. Good heavens, Catherine, if you're going to dream, try to dream up something useful. Kath knotted her fingers in the blanket. Well, we can have fresh rose water at least, and maybe I'll bake up some rose macarons. No. I don't mean useful in things you can bake with or cook with. I mean useful, like a crown. A crown? Her mother hid her face behind her thick fingers. Oh, this night has shredded my poor old nerves. First, that awful Cheshire cat appears right when the king is getting ready to make his announcement. Then you're nowhere to be found. Then the Jabberwock. She shuddered. And now a rose tree growing up in the middle of my house. Honestly, Catherine, I don't mean to argue, Mama, but a crown doesn't really do much of anything. Just sits on one's head. Quite useless. Oh, I suppose it sparkles. Focus, child. Don't you see? The king intended to ask for your hand in marriage. Tonight. Marianne gasped, and Kath felt like her own feigned surprise was a bit sluggish. Why? What an absurd suggestion, she said, chuckling. The king? Certainly not. The Marquess awkwardly cleared his throat, startling her mother, who spun to him with flapping arms. Yes, we're done with you, darling, she said. Go to bed. We need to have a mother-to-daughter chat. Her father looked grateful to be sent away. Dark circles were beneath his eyes as he leaned over Kath and placed a kiss on the top of her head. I'm glad you're safe. Good night, Papa. Marianne curtsied to him as he left, then cast an excited smile in Kath's direction. I'll just bring up some tea, she suggested, to calm everyone's nerves. Thank you, Marianne, said the Marchioness. She waited until she and Kath were alone before taking Kath's hands into both of hers. My dear, sweet, stupid child, she started, and Kath's shoulders tensed in defense. It is not absurd at all. The king means to make you his bride. Now, I am overjoyed that you made it home safely, but that doesn't excuse your absence, not on such an occasion as this. Where were you? Memories of chocolate caramels and unlaced corsets flashed through Catherine's mind. She blinked all innocence. As I said, I was feeling poorly and thought I should leave so as not to cause a scene. I didn't want to interrupt the lovely time you and Papa seemed to be having, so I took one of the royal carriages. Besides, I think you're mistaken about the king. Her mother's face turned red as a cabbage. I am not mistaken, you doltish girl. You should be engaged by now." "But His Majesty has never shown me any preference. Well, other than for my baking. But even if he had, we've had no courtship. No time to..." "He is the king. What need does he have to courtship? He asks and you say yes. That is all the courtship requires." She heaved an exhausted sigh. Or it would have been. Now that you disappeared at the most inopportune moment, who knows what's to become of his affections? He could be jilted. His attachment may be permanently severed. Catherine pursed her lips, trying to disguise the influx of hope beneath a veil of concern. If the king wished to request my hand in marriage, I should hope his attachment wouldn't be so flimsy as that. And I'm still not convinced of his intentions. Oh, he very much intended, and he had better still intend. Or you will confine to this room until you learn when it is and is not appropriate to leave a ball, she hesitated. While murderous beast notwithstanding. You must fix this, Catherine. What do you expect me to do? I expect you to apologize for leaving the gala prematurely. I expect you to be around the next time a man makes you an offer that will make you a queen. We must think of some way to ensure we haven't lost his good graces. Something to keep him from changing his mind, not when we were so close. But what if I don't? She trailed off, curling her knees up to her chest. What if you don't what? Spit it out, child. She gulped, hesitated, sagged. What if I don't see His Majesty for a while? We can't very well call on the king, and we have no invitations, do we? Her mother smugly tilted her nose up. In fact, we do have an invitation. We have been asked to afternoon tea in the castle gardens in 3 days' time. She snapped her fingers. I know. You should bring His Majesty a gift. That will be the perfect excuse to approach him. He is fond of your sweets. She stood and took to pacing the room, the light from the lamp casting a restless shadow over the walls. What do you think he'd like? Anything, I suppose. Why are you being difficult? Kath shrugged. I didn't mean to be, Mama. What about those rose macarons I mentioned? Yes, perfect. What are rose macarons? Kath prepared an explanation, but her mother was already waving off the question. Never mind, I'm sure they'll be fine. Now, try to get some sleep. You know you pump up when you're not sleeping well. Fluttering her arms, she bustled out of the room, nearly crashing into Marianne's tea tray on the way out. After the Marchioness had gone, Marianne slipped inside and shut the door with her foot. She turned her wide eyes on Catherine and abandoned the tray on the nightstand. Can it be true, Catherine? Catherine collapsed back on her pillows. I don't wish to believe it either. A Jabberwock? In Hearts? The attack must have been awful. Marianne froze, her thoughts tripping over the topic. Oh yes, it was awful. It happened so fast I barely caught sight of the beast as it was flying away with one courtier in each of its big gangly claws. She grimaced. No one knew what to do. The ballroom was in chaos, everyone wanting to flee, but too afraid to go outside. Then, the Joker showed up out of nowhere. He's rather uncanny, don't you think? And insisted that the king have everyone gather together in the Great Hall until it was deemed safe to leave. That's when we realized you were missing, and the Joker tried to call Mama. He told her that he'd seen a girl in a red gown get into a carriage, and he was sure you were safe. But we couldn't send a messenger, and we were stuck inside for hours. Her face pinched with worry. I'm so glad you're all right. Well, mostly right. Kath rose up onto one elbow. The Joker gathered everyone in the Great Hall? Marianne nodded. He was very calm about it, while the king was, well, you know how he is. Her lips stretched into a smile. Or shall we say, your sweetheart." "We certainly shall not." She collapsed backward again. "I'm exhausted thinking about it." Marianne laughed. "Oh yes, it must be tiresome, being a favorite of the king himself." "Are we speaking of the same man? The short one with the funny curled beard? The one who never stops wriggling?" Marianne settled onto the bed beside Catherine. "Don't be mean. If you had trapped in the castle with the rest of us, the king would have had to protect you from the beast. Or, at the least, he would have ordered the clubs to protect you, as is much more practical given the circumstances. It's very nearly romantic. Why would we be discussing your engagement right now?" She lay down beside Catherine, fluffing a pillow beneath her head. Catherine pried open one eye. "You can't mean it." "Mean what?" Shoving away the blankets, Catherine flopped off the mattress. "Have you met the king?" she asked, adjusting her nightgown. "Practical? Romantic? Rubbish! I can't marry him." Marianne sat up, eyes wide. "Why not?" "You would be the queen." "I don't want to be the queen. I don't know. If ever I get married, I want there to be romance and passion. I want to fall in love." Kath poured some tea into a cup, annoyed at how her hands shook. She was flushed from talk of the king, from news of the Jabberwock, but mostly she knew from the dream. Romance, passion, love. She had never experienced them before, but she imagined they would leave her feeling like that dream had. Like the Joker did, with his quick smiles and witty remarks. She felt like she could talk to him for hours, for days and months and years, and never tire of it. But he was a court joker. He was an impossibility. She gulped hard and tried to tether her emotions back to the ground. "None of that matters anyway," she said, half to herself. "Marry the king, bah! What I want is to open our bakery. That's what I've always wanted." Marianne scooted to the edge of the bed. "I want that too, of course," she said. "But Kath, the bakery, much as we've talked of it, has always been, well, something of a silly dream, don't you think?" Kath spun to face her, surprised at the jolt of betrayal the words caused. "Silly?" Marianne held up her hands in defense. "Not like that. It's a good dream. A lovely thought, truly. But we've been discussing it for years. And yet we're no close to having any money, not without selling off your dowry. We don't have any support. No one will think we're capable of it. I refuse to accept that. I am the best baker in all of Hearts, and everyone who has tasted my pastries knows it. I don't think you understand." Kath set down the cup without taking a drink. "What don't I understand? You're the daughter of a marquess. Look around. Look at the things you have. The life you're accustomed to. You don't know what it's like to work every day so you can feed yourself and keep a roof over your head. You don't know what it's like to be poor, to be a servant. We'll be businesswomen, not servants. Or," said Marianne, "you could be a queen." Kath inhaled a sharp breath. "I can run any amount of calculations, consider every angle of profits, of losses, but our little insignificant bakery will never come close to providing what the king would offer you. The clothes, the food, the security." Marianne's eyes glazed over, and though her words struck Kath as boringly practical, she could see this was not the first time Marianne had considered what life must be like for someone who was more than a maid. "Yes," said Kath, "but I would be married to the king, and I can hardly stand to be near him for a 5-minute waltz. How could I stand an entire lifetime?" Marianne looked like she meant to defend His Majesty, but she hesitated. "He is ridiculous, isn't he? Divorced? You don't think there's any hope of you coming to love him? Kath thought of the king, squat and impish, and flighty as a butterfly. She tried to imagine being wed to him, stooping down to kiss him, her mouth tickled by his curled mustache, listening to his giggles as they bounced through the castle corridors, watching his childish, gleeful expressions every time he won a round of croquet. She shuddered. I'm sure that I couldn't. Slipping off the bed, Marianne poured a cup of tea for herself. Well, you have 3 days to think on it. Perhaps your heart will soften in that time. Kath shut her eyes, glad that Marianne was ending this conversation. She never wanted to think about it again, but she knew she would have to. In 3 days, her mother expected her to bring a gift of rose macarons to afternoon tea at the castle. In 3 days, she would have to face His Majesty. You came home by yourself last night? Marianne asked, heaping each cup with sugar. Yes. How did you manage to get the corset off? Catherine looked away. The ties had come loose during the ball. All that dancing. She trailed off, accepting the improved cup of tea and deigned to change the subject. I think we should go look at the cobbler shop this morning. I want to see the home of our future bakery. Marianne smiled, but there was restraint behind it. That sounds like a nice outing, Lady Catherine. For the first time, Kath could see that she alone believed wholeheartedly that her plan could work, would work. She had never thought she might have to persuade Marianne of it too. But then she pictured the King of Hearts standing before her, holding her hand. She grimaced to think of that small, clammy hand in hers, and then his request to be his bride, to be his wife. There would be no passion, no romance, no love. But she could picture precisely how he would smile at her, so hapless, so hopeful. Her stomach roiled. Can she ever say yes to that? As she took a sip of tea, a more important question struck her. Could she ever say no?